So, development is, of course, an imperative part to furthering the quality of life for all of us humans. But what about wildlife? Unsustainable development has some seriously detrimental effects on animals, both on land and in our lakes, rivers, oceans, and every water body in between. On land, various things can have vast negative effects. Deforestation, probably one we've all heard about, is very harmful as it destroys shelter, food sources, and disrupts the natural balance in ecosystems. This is one of the largest problems in Singapore and currently accounts for 37% of extinctions since the 19th century. This, however terrible it is, isn't the only plague to our animals. Roads that cut through natural areas create a lot of roadkill. Then construction work directly harms life if they get in its way. And us, yup, me and you, mingling within their habitats is also a contributor, such as littering, which also directly hurts marine wildlife. Ever heard of turtles consuming a plastic bag only to die from it because it mistook it for jellyfish? That was probably the consequence of some inconsiderate person or people. There are more problems plaguing the sea critters, such as land reclamation encroaching on ecosystems such as coral reefs and chemical runoffs from industrial processes or accidents such as oil. I'm sure you've heard of the oil spill in June, which was thankfully taken care of really well by the government, though that's not always the case everywhere. Lastly, though, there are certainly more problems. Construction near water bodies and dams alter water flow, changing the local habitat, and it may cause other problems like excess sediment being dislodged and loosed in the water, blocking sunlight for photosynthesis and smothering corals. Phew, that was heavy. While these problems do exist, let us propose some solutions to combat them. Firstly, we could build more, wider wildlife bridges, such as the Mandai Wildlife Bridge, a bridge that allows animals to cross busy roads, effectively reducing roadkill. Then rather than destroying more habitats, we could continue to develop the already urbanized areas, perhaps by expanding up or down, though not too much and sustainably, of course. Third, since reclaiming coasts are highly disruptive to marine life, we could work to reduce the need to do, and hopefully stop doing it at some point. Four, to reduce the amount of toxic chemicals and waste our waters are exposed to, treating sewage and industrial waste before disposing is a great way to go about it. Five, we could invest more into aquaponics. Fish waste and plant minerals can be used as fertilizer and nutrition for marine life respectively, and both can be harvested sustainably. Lastly, keeping industries away from natural land reduces soil and air pollution, and sustainable living and energy goes a very long way.
For more insight into this issue and its solutions, let's introduce Ms.Alpana Ahuja, an executive at the Animal Concerns Research and Education Society, ACRES.
Ms.Alpana Ahuja. I'm an artist and illustrator. I've illustrated children's books, and I love painting nature and animals. And I discovered Acres in 2005 at a roadshow, and my eyes were opened to the bear bile trade, which I found horrifying. I learned about bears in captivity, being kept in farms, and how Acres did an undercover, and how Acres was trying to make sure that Chinese traditional medicine, that is TCM, does not sell bear bile in Singapore. And also they were also investigating other wildlife crime. So I liked what Acres was doing, and I decided to volunteer with them. And so along the years, I got more and more involved. Initially, it was just being an artist. I would just do like brochures or paintings or whatever education material they need. I would, draw it out for them, and or posters. And then slowly, I became more involved. I started fundraising for them through my art. At the annual gala, I would give my art for an auction, and then slowly I started reaching out to schools and to bring tours to Acres. By then, we had a wildlife sanctuary over there, and we had like a rehab center. So I would bring groups of people to visit Acres, like on a tour. And then slowly, I took the training for wildlife rescue, and I started doing wildlife rescue as well. So yeah, so it's been, and then in 2015 they invited me to be a board member at the Expo, part of the Expo. So I'm a board member at Acres, and yeah, so I'm very deeply involved with Acres. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. I'll be handing it over to Aaron now.
Okay.
All right.
So, do you believe that Singapore's shores are being overdeveloped and causing harm to its marine wildlife?
So Singapore is a small island, and yes, development will happen.
Yeah.
Um, so they have, for the marine part, right? I feel that they have taken a good balanced approach. There is an area which is off Ubin, which is kept for conservation. It's called um, there's a lady called Ria Tan working on the conservation, and I'm forgetting the name, but I can send you the name later. I think it's called Czech Java. Yeah, that's right. It's Czech Java, and a lot of conservation is so that was also slated for development, but the nature folks here got active and they persuaded the government to leave that alone and not to reclaim it, not to develop it, but to preserve it for. So they have corals there and they have a lot of other things. And there's a couple of other sites, I think, of Saint John's Islands or Sisters Islands or somewhere where there is some marine conservation happening. So I think in that sense, there is a balance, in my opinion.
All right. So, for the next question, to what extent are national parks protecting Singapore's wildlife? Are they enough to maintain its unique ecosystem?
Uh, so if you look at from the nature people's point of view, it's never enough because it's always a shrinking habitat. But what is good about it is that these nature reserves are really great because they do contain a lot of wildlife, and this wildlife is protected. Unlike a lot of countries where most of the wildlife would have got poached by now, but in Singapore, because of the awareness, the education, and also the protection given and the hefty fines, I guess, are a deterrent. The wildlife is fairly well protected. Um, about the shrinking habitat, yes, there are certain areas which when we saw them go, it was very a very sad feeling. There was a beautiful forest called Tagore Forest, and we were hoping that it would not, but it was all cut down for
Yeah.
development. And then there's another forest which is closer to acres called Tenga, which is also it had a lot of abundant wildlife, and it's a very important area to connect to the northern areas of Singapore. So, yeah, so Tenga has also been cut down substantially. So, what I feel is that a lot of areas within the city could be utilized better. And perhaps some of the low rise homes could be converted to high rise homes to solve the housing problem
Yeah.
rather than enter into the nature reserves and keep cut. I mean, some of these are not classified as nature reserves, like Tenga was not classified as a nature reserve, but I think it needs to. I think whatever rainforest we have left right now, I don't think any more should be cut because the rainforest is what provides us with clean air and clean water. So I think it's very, very precious what we have in Singapore. I don't
Yeah.
think you can put a price tag on this kind of a forest, which is actually it attracts water to us because the clouds cool down and that's how the rain falls. So forests are extremely precious. So yeah, I totally feel that if land could be better utilized and we go high rise, it would be better than cutting down the forest.
Okay. So, for my last question, in your opinion, how should land and resources be split between development and environmental protection? And currently, should they be focused more on development or the environment, or should there be a neutral balance?
Yeah, it has to be balanced, of course. Everything is good if it's balanced. Overdevelopment is never a great idea. If you look at totally concrete cities, it's not very pleasant to look out of the window and see complete sea of concrete. And having nature, of course, Singapore is a very green city, and I think if Singapore has a fairly good balanced approach to conserving nature and development. But the problem is that I don't know if the development carries on at the same rate, then where are we headed? That is the question. I think the areas which are protected should remain protected for future generations. There are
Yeah.
some very interesting forests. Again, there was Dover Forest, which was very interesting, and there were people trying to conserve it, but it's always a losing battle, I feel. Yeah, which is if you look down 20 years later, I'm just worried that will these little patches of forest even remain.
Yeah. Since so to add on to that, since development is so much in Singapore right now, do you think that maybe the government should put a little bit more emphasis on protecting the environment, or should they just currently try to look at a neutral balance?
Me being a nature loving person would definitely say that we should not cut down any more forests anymore at all. So
Yeah.
you see, they do have an excellent program, which is the tree planting, 1 million trees. But these are all new trees, and the biodiversity that one loses when a mature tree or a mature forest is cut down is actually irreplaceable. It will take, I don't know, few hundred years to replace that kind of biodiversity, because nobody has even studied it fully to see what microorganisms and what actually is there in these old these old ecosystems that exist within the rainforest. The whole tree is actually an old tree, like a mature tree is a ecosystem within itself. So when you plant new trees, you actually lose a lot of biodiversity. So I think the old trees are really precious.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'll pass it on to Gia now.
Okay, so for my first question, how do you feel about the government's recent decision to develop Singapore more by clearing land to create new BTO HDB flats and MRT lines? And what do you think its impact will be on Singapore's wildlife?
Um, yeah, I feel sad. I feel sad when I see a forest being cut down. I feel like sitting there and crying, but I really don't know what to do. I feel so helpless also, because to me this rainforest is extremely precious. It's there's no money value to it. It's so priceless. Um, what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
Um, how do you think it impacts Singapore's wildlife?
How Yeah, the wildlife. No, wildlife does get impacted because it's fragmented. Wildlife needs corridors to move from place to place, I think, which the government is working on. They are working on connecting wildlife corridors, and I think corridors like this would be great for wildlife to reach one part to, to another. So I mean, I wish we could save more of the forest. That's what I'll say.
Okay, for the next question, by working for acres, how has your view on the impact national development and progress has had on wildlife change?
uh, how has my work I our work actually has spread a lot of education. So ACRES has been around for 22 years now, 22 or 23. I think 2001 would be 23 years. So ACRES has spread a lot of education. I think when we first started doing wildlife rescue, not many people knew about ACRES. Also, the so now when we sort of we are doing rescues, we find that there's a lot of awareness amongst people who call us. They already know about our work, they already give a lot of respect to our work. Whereas earlier, when we first started rescuing snakes and all, people would question us, why are you saving snakes? Snakes are harmless, snakes can bite, snakes, why are you saving them? But now the younger generation especially has a very deeper understanding of how natural cycles work, like the snake will eat rats and so on and so forth, and it's a natural pest control system for acres for Singapore. So I think that understanding is there, is out there. So I think acres work has really I see the outlook changing. I have seen the outlook changing since 2005 when I started volunteering, and now I see a huge difference amongst the attitude of the people towards wildlife. They are very keen to conserve wildlife. They are very keen to preserve wildlife, native wildlife. So yeah, so in that sense, Acres work has had an impact.
Yes, thank you.
Is
And for
that what
my
you wanted to know something about how his acres work changed my outlook? Was it that or?
both is all right if you want to talk about how it has changed your outlook.
See, for me, right, I was just a dog lover when I joined Acres. I was very, very fond of, fascinated by wildlife and all, but I didn't know much. And I joined Acres, and I learned everything from them by just being there, by learning about the species. I had no clue about what it. I mean, once also native wildlife wasn't that visible back then. You see, because now the habitat is shrinking, so animals are kind of spilling out of the reserves, and they are found very often in urban spaces. But in 2005, I had never seen a civet, and I never heard of a civet in anybody's. I'd never seen one, and occasionally there would be snakes. I mean, we were rescuing wildlife only when we were called, but it was not commonly visible as it is today because of the shrinking habitat. The habitat is much less today than it was 20 years ago. So, yes, so I learned everything from Acres. Whatever I know today is thanks to Acres.
Thank you. And for my last question, do you have any suggestions on how the government can adopt more environmentally sustainable development practices to not harm Singapore's biodiversity and environment?
I think, again, I'd say the same thing that there are pockets of land within the cities, built up areas which can be better utilized. They could be empty areas like golf courses, or they could be old buildings which are not really being used for a few years. Sometimes you pass certain areas where you find large pieces of land just lying empty, like grassland. I remember off Upper Thompson there is a large piece of land, and I would keep thinking that why was isn't this built up, and why is a new forest being cut? Because this large piece of land could have housed many buildings. But they have a plan about what they are doing, and one can just hope. And there are organizations engaging the government, like Nature Society Singapore, and there are other nature groups who are constantly engaging the government to try and preserve as much as possible of the natural forest. So one can hope that these are preserved.
Yes, thank you for answering my questions. Lastly, I would pass it on to Michelle to ask her questions.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Jia. So, my first question is: in what ways has the Mandai Wildlife Bridge been effective in reducing the negative impacts of highway development on local wildlife, and what challenges still remain?
By Mandai, do you mean the new road which goes to the zoo, that development, or do you mean the
Yes,
old one, the new
the
one?
old one.
The
The old
old
one.
one is on BKE actually. The old
Hmm.
wildlife crossing is on BKE, Bukit Timah Highway.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the really old one. So I believe that animals are using it, but it's taken them, I think, quite a while to begin to use it. Also, in my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, that it's too narrow a bridge. Animals need wider crossings. Animals are not able to read signboards which says bridge ahead. So you see, they are used to a certain track by which they take the forest. And suddenly, because I've seen it with my own eyes, we saw a wild boar run over. The wild boar, because a new road was constructed. So basically, the forest was cut and a new road was made. And the wild boar was used to crossing that area. They have a sense of direction in their head. They follow, they follow their instinct. So they know when they move, they use the same pathway sometimes, and the wild boar was just doing his thing. He was just going on the same path he goes every day, but he got hit by a vehicle. So for animals, right, it doesn't work like humans. Like humans can read signs and they can understand there's a bridge to cross over. But animals will just cross over at the spots where they used to cross over earlier. And suddenly there's a highway there. So I think animals, a lot of times there has to be very strong fencings which don't allow animals to climb over, and then they can be led towards these crossings. So in Malaysia, there is an example of a very interesting highway. So what they did there was they left the forest intact and they raised the highway over the forest. So the animals were not disturbed. So I think that's a better way of going, because you can raise the highway for a few kilometers and you can leave the forest undisturbed below. But I'm not sure, because Malaysia is a much larger country, they have more land. So I'm not sure how feasible it is for Singapore. And
So despite
The new Mandai highway that was built, well, before, while it was being built, there were a lot of animals being run over there. Yeah, we have pangolins being run over and a lot of other wildlife which was run over. Yeah, so that was sad.
despite the strict laws and enforcement, what challenges does Singapore face in effectively combating wildlife trafficking and its impact on endangered species?
So apparently, Singapore is quite the hub for wildlife trafficking. A lot of wildlife goes through Changi Airport, and of course, the laws here are very strict. And if that wildlife is caught, then there are stringent fines that people have to pay. But very often, what happens is the kingpin is never caught. The person who is sending the consignment, because it changes hands several times over. Sometimes you will never know the original sender of this whole consignment, and they use forwarding companies, and the forwarding companies are forwarding so much freight, like tons and tons of freight, that they cannot check every box that comes through. So um, I think sniffer dogs are very good at sniffing out wildlife consignment. So if they would use more sniffer dogs, I guess more consignments would get caught. Of course, every few years one reads about this massive consignment of ivory and pangolin, which is caught in Singapore. And of course, once it's confiscated, they will incinerate it, just burn it. They will not allow it out of the country. Um, but the problem is it's the location of Singapore. It it is very close to Indonesia, which has a lot of wildlife, and a lot of poaching takes place. And it is also a route for wildlife from Africa to go to China, Vietnam, Laos. These are the places where normally wildlife is headed to. So Singapore being a large trading hub, yes, a lot of wildlife does go through Singapore.